And welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur. Looking forward to the conversation today. Gonna tackle some issues like Donald Trump and his promised tariffs on Canadian exports and our response to that as Canadian politicians. And of course, tied in with that is border security, immigration, lots of stuff to lump together here today. And our guest today has some pretty strong opinions on these things. He's a very well-informed gentleman, Leighton Grey. You'll recognize that name as, of course, the host of the Grey Matter podcast. He's also one of Canada's top attorneys, by the way. So return to reason.com. You can catch his podcast there as well on X at Grey Matter Convo, and of course on Miracle Channel Television. So thanks for making time for us here today, Leighton.
Well, what a blessing it is to be here with you. I hope I'm not speaking out of school by telling people that you were my mentor in media. I actually went through a crash course with you. So if people have complaints about the way I talk and the way I act on camera, it's all your fault.
It's on me. Leighton, you have a great show. You have some great guests, great topics, and again, I just really appreciate the depth of your knowledge on a lot of these things. Of course, you've got, people may not know that. I think you've got like a degree in history as well, right? Which really plays into this, and a doctorate in philosophy. So it's not just the law angle. So a lot of different sources of that fountain of knowledge coming up there. So, well, let's start with Trump here. Sure. He's, of course, planning most people realize this, a 25% tariff on Canadian exports to the U.S., also on Mexico, unless we tighten our border security. Okay, now part of that, of course, would be specifically, fentanyl crossing from Canada over to the U.S. They're concerned about that, and also concerned about illegal aliens going into the U.S. and potentially, some terrorists with that, because we are pretty lax on our immigration laws and so forth in Canada, it seems. So, maybe a couple things off the bat here. First of all, in one sense, that's the U.S.'s job, right? America's job is to patrol their own border to stop drugs from coming across and, illegal aliens. So there is that angle. And any thoughts on that to begin with?
Well, you're absolutely right. That is their job. Their job is to control their own borders and to protect the American people from the things you're talking about. So that's absolutely true. Although having said that, we've got this 49th parallel, the longest undefended border in the world, I believe in world history. And, we've done a pretty good job of cooperating with the Americans over the past couple of centuries or so. And I think the Americans are just concerned that, I think they're concerned on a number of fronts that I could get into that. But I would say on the strict legal question of who's responsible for controlling their border, I would say that you're bang on.
Okay, so it falls more on them, but let's face it, with Donald Trump, that doesn't matter, right? He's a bull in a china shop. So, and of course, this is the world's largest economy, most powerful nation in the world. So, I think it behooves us to believe that he actually may mean what he says. It's possible he may back off of that and so forth, but he has a very good point on the lax border security. So, what do you think of the Prime Minister's response so far? He's talking about considering apparently putting retaliatory tariffs on things like oil, potash, uranium, things that the U.S. really needs. What's that response sounding like to you?
Well, at first blush, it sounds like pure lunacy. I hate to use this analogy, but it's like, David with his slingshot aiming at Goliath, except I think we might be on the wrong end of this thing from God's point of view. But, it's interesting that these things that Mr. Trudeau points to are all things that impact Western Canada. And those of us in Western Canada know that this Prime Minister is no friend to us, particularly in economic terms. So it's interesting that he's going to start a tariff war that's going to hurt Western Canada more than Central Canada. But I think the bigger picture view here that I think people need to understand, and people who've lived in Canada for a long time, like you and I, know this. Americans don't think very much about Canada, or at least they haven't until recently. Robin Williams had a funny joke. He once called, Canada a loft apartment over a great party. But interestingly, what's happening right now is not just Donald Trump, but other people who are going to be filling key roles in his cabinet are paying very close and constant attention to Canada. It's almost embarrassing for us, shy, self-effacing Canadians to get all this attention from the United States. But I think what Trump and other people in his cabinet, people like Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., JD Vance, Vivek Ramaswamy, and even Elon Musk are signaling is Americans, that at least the Trump administration, or the Trump administration that's going to be 2.0, is very concerned about the domestic politics of Canada. And I can understand why, because for the first time in my lifetime, perhaps for the first time since, I don't know, 1812, Canada actually poses a geopolitical threat to the safety and security of the United States. It's not just the border. I mean, look at the things that are going on in Canada. Who are we close to right now? We're enemies with almost everyone, including now the United States. Our closest ally seems to be the CCP. This is very, very sure. We have confirmed evidence, although we don't have a proper investigation because the Liberals are forestalling it. We have confirmed evidence that the Chinese have interfered in at least our last two national elections. All kinds of crazy stuff. Canada has sort of become, to the United States, almost like what Cuba might have been prior to the Castro Revolution in 1959. So I think that the Americans are very, very concerned. I think Mr. Trump and his administration are very, very concerned about what's going on in Canada. And I think that if I were a fly on the wall at Mar-a-Lago a couple of weeks ago, when our prime minister was summoned down there, I think that Justin got told that the Communist Party, pardon the pun, is over, and that Canada's got to get back to being a good neighbor to the United States, and that they better get on board with MAGA. And MAGA being, we could talk about this too, MAGA being a made in America response to globalism, whereas Canada is right on board with. If you take go to the
we're
WEF,
in the globalism party thing here.
We're the poster child for global. We are the post nation state, and so I think that the tariffs and the talk about the border and things like that is the boots on the ground response. It's the manifestation.
I think you're right. In the sense that Canada is almost an open door to slip in the back door, I guess, to access secrets in the U.S. if we have a lax security, lax spy network, if you will, right? All these kinds of things. If they can infiltrate our politicians, our schools, our education system, our businesses, our economics, from countries like like China and others. I'm sure it's not just China, and so that's a real thorn in the side for the U.S. And it's best that we should actually pay attention. Because they're really, really big neighbors, and we should. We have basically a lot of things in common as far as values go and so forth.
Yes.
And we need to make that keep working. Need to be good neighbors. Now, Ontario Premier Doug Ford has perhaps even a step further. Threatening to cut off the electricity supply to the U.S. Wow. Okay. Any thoughts on Mr. Ford there?
Well, truly a bizarre response because, of course, that's going to do more harm to the people of Ontario than it is to the United States. The United States has access to many other forms of energy and sources of energy, including oil from other parts of the world, where Quebec, for example, is buying their oil from. So I don't think this. I think a lot of this is saber rattling. I think it's virtue signaling. But it's interesting to see Mr. Ford, who was a quote unquote conservative premier, basically marching in lockstep with the prime minister's position. This seems rather odd, but perhaps not so much so for the people of Ontario who have been watching very closely the behavior of this government. I think, in my respectful view, Mr. Ford's government is conservative in name only. I don't think there's any question that their actual politics are left of center. I think that's probably true of Alberta's UCP party, though, by the way.
Ah, interesting. So talking the talk, but maybe not quite walking the walk in some areas.
But it depends how you define what a conservative is, right?
Yes, it's a bit nuanced, for sure. Okay. Let me ask you a legal question here. So, legally speaking,
Sure.
if the tariffs do get put in place, I mean, we have a free trade agreement, right? So, is that breaking international law? Can Trump do that?
Well, we had a free trade agreement. You probably remember, Chrystia Freeland, who until very recently was our finance minister and deputy
Yeah.
prime minister. She's out, but one of the first big jobs she was given in the Trudeau cabinet was to go down and renegotiate
Mm-hmm.
the free trade agreement. Remember in
Yeah.
Trump 1.0. And that agreement got reworked. And I'm not familiar, honestly, with all the subtle
Mm-hmm.
nuances there. But I don't think that I think Trump is a very transactional type of leader,
Yeah.
and I don't think he much cares whether the things he does offends international law
I think
or
you're
breaks
right.
UN conventions. I think that he's going to sort of apply the Pierre Elliott Trudeau credo, which is just watch me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he doesn't have to win the next. Well, as a matter of fact, he can't. Go for a third term, so it doesn't matter to him, right? In that sense, he's in, and he's going to do what he's going to do.
Mhm.
Now,
Yeah.
we simply do not have an adequate border security system in Canada for sure. I'm hearing figures like we need an extra 3,000 border guards and a whole swack of RCMP and more equipment to monitor that whole long border there. And some of it's apparently they're talking about actually doing some of that. We'll find out if that actually plays out or not. But I think you'd agree we need to do something, right, to sharpen up that border.
Well, I mean, people have very short memories. It wasn't so long ago that we had Chinese spy balloons floating across
Yeah.
Canada,
Yep.
and we actually had to ask the Americans to bring fighter jets into Canadian airspace to shoot them down because we didn't have the resources to do it. But
It's
you're quite
embarrassing.
right, and it's interesting because when you look at our Constitution, that is what is supposed to be the founding legal framework for our country.
Hmm.
One of the main things that the federal government is supposed to do is to protect our borders
Yeah.
and to protect us from foreign invaders. That's one of the main things that the federal government is supposed to do. And unfortunately, this federal government is so decrepit in doing all the things, virtually all the things that it's supposed to do, and it's so busy doing many things that it's not supposed to do, including interfering in things like healthcare and natural
Mm.
resources and controlling people's speech and trying to confiscate guns. That's not actually doing the basic jobs that it's supposed to do. And unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, this job is now falling to the provinces.
Yeah.
And we have the premier of Saskatchewan and the premier of Alberta have now reached out directly
Yep.
to President Trump, to the Americans, saying, "Look, we don't know what Trudeau's doing, but we don't want a tariff war with you. And by the way, whatever you want us to do to secure our borders, we're
Wow.
going to do it." So I don't believe I don't believe the federal government is going to do. I think the federal government trying to control our borders is like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic at this point. I don't think they're going to do anything. I don't think they're serious
Mm.
about that because I happen to think that Canada is being run by people outside of Canada. That is the federal government is. I
Mm.
have more confidence in some of the provincial governments, especially the
Interesting.
ones in Saskatchewan and Alberta,
Yeah.
would seem, and I would say Quebec as well, who seem very sincerely interested in taking care of the best interests of their constituents. Excuse me.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, and I'm glad we are seeing somebody, rise up here in Canada, to take that on for sure. I was absolutely flabbergasted when I read an article here that the Canadian Border Services themselves admit that the trains going back and forth across our borders, a lot of trains, tons of stuff getting moved back and forth between our two nations. And yeah, you'd think they maybe check once in a while to see what's in those things. Anything illegal going back and forth? 0%, apparently.
Yep.
They do not
Yep.
check the trains. I was
Nope.
absolutely, I mean, you've got to be kidding me. I mean, that's just dumber than dumb.
Yes, and it's very scary, especially when you consider that, I think you might have pointed out, Canada is a net exporter of fentanyl to the United
Mm,
States. That
hmm
is that
hmm
is that is not only embarrassing, that is shameful. That is a
It
blight on
is. It
Canada.
is. Yeah.
We're not being a very good neighbor to our American friends by helping to import this filth. It just kills people and
Yep.
destroys. Actually, it killed George Floyd.
Mm.
The one that
Yep.
they're
Yep.
erecting all the statues to. So, I mean, really, there's all kinds of problems with this. It's hard to know where to begin, but I think it starts with a reconsideration of what the relationship is going to be between Canada and the United States going forward. And
Hmm.
it's going to be very interesting to see what the next federal government in Canada, the approach that they
Yeah.
take, because Mr. Poilievre has in the polls, it seems like he's poised to become the next prime minister.
Yeah.
He's going to have the greatest majority since Brian Mulroney in 1984. And the question is, what is he going to do with that? Is it going to be business as usual, or are we going to see a real sea change in Canadian politics so that we get back
Hmm.
to, let's say, something that feels more like the way life used to be before 2015 in this country?
Yeah, I mean, we'll certainly hope and pray for that. I mean, on paper, you think they're both fairly conservative, so hopefully they will align themselves somewhat in a friendly relationship, mutual cooperation, especially on security issues. Now, immigration, of course, is a big part of this. Touched on
Yes.
that earlier. I mean, Trump concerned, and I think rightfully so, that Canada is potentially allowing terrorists into our country, and then, of
Yeah.
course, across the border into the U.S. So how does it work here? I mean, somehow we've got to get. I know there's a questionnaire that they have to fill out if they're coming to Canada from other countries, but I'm told there's not a lot of face-to-face interviews and so forth. So I think it would make sense to the vast majority of Canadians that we would ensure that people coming to live in our country would have similar Western values. If their values are completely opposed to ours, if they believe in, bribes or, extortion, violence, these kinds of things, no women's rights or whatever it might be, or extremism and when it comes to religious beliefs and so forth, do we want these people living next door to me and you? I mean, I think
Hmm.
not, right? So are we asking these questions? I don't know that we are we?
I don't think that is happening. I listened to a podcast recently where our former premier Jason Kenney was interviewed, and some might remember he was the minister of immigration in Mr. Harper's government right before the Trudeau regime
Right. Mm-hmm.
came to power, and he said something really astonishing. Your viewers and listeners will be just if they haven't heard these numbers, they will be truly astonished. He said that when they left office in 2015, they had 13,000 refugee claims, 13,000 in the whole country.
Wow,
And they
that's
were
not.
getting people processed within 3 months.
That's yeah,
Mr.
amazing.
Mr. Kenny says, I don't know how he knows this, but he seems to be in the know, and I wouldn't be surprised if these numbers are accurate. He says there's no less than 500,000 refugee applicants right now,
Yep.
and that they're looking at years before people have their hearings. That's how, I mean, we overuse this word in Canada. That's how broken the system is. I don't know if it's broken, but it needs a lot of thread, needs a lot of mending, and I think a big part of it is we have to get the right people in there, and we have to change our whole approach to immigration and to taking in refugees, because right now, and of course, the prime minister in Canada has reluctantly admitted that Angela Merkel, the same thing she admitted before him, and Mr. Starmer in Britain, and Mr. Macron, they've all admitted the same thing, and that is the idea of open borders. This globalist policy of open
Yep.
borders is a complete and utter failure. And so, for that matter, is the concept of multiculturalism. It simply is a failed ideology. It's much like Marxism. It looks great to some degree in theory, but in practice, it really is awful and it causes human misery. And it has been to the immiseration of Canadians that
Mm.
we have so many people in our country that we're actually in danger of losing the fundamental character of our nation.
Yes.
Um, there are conspiracy theorists who would say, well, that's the point. Justin Trudeau, after all, said that Canada was to be the first post nation state. it's somewhat of it's some biting irony for our prime minister that if Canada is going to be a post nation state, it appears that we're all going to be Americans. We're going to be the 51st state. Uh,
Oh my. Yeah, that's a whole show in itself, I think, right there.
yes, it
But
is. Yeah.
yeah, you're right. The whole globalism thing again. Trudeau seems to be very, very supportive of that. Where are we at as Canadians? Are we supportive of that? You look at some of the recent polls, and man, we've always been pro-immigration, and I think Canadians have kind hearts. We want to help people, and that's a good thing. That's a God thing, but. At the same time, if we let in X amount of, immigrants who don't share the same values, are they going to undermine our country and turn us into a hodgepodge of, well, look at all the pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas rallies that we've seen. People celebrating October 7th, saying death to Canada, death to Israel, death to America. You see where the mindset is there, and if that continues to expand in our nation, we've got all kinds of problems coming our way. Any thoughts on where we're at with some of these rallies and some of them turning violent and so forth? And again, we're not really seeming to crack down on them a whole bunch.
Well, I think that that certainly is a problem. We seem to have selective approach depending on who is protesting and what the protesting is
Yes.
about. What's interesting to me is that some of these protesters seem to be very, very well funded. They all have the same tents and the same signs, and I suspect that, and I don't think I'm going too far down the rabbit hole, that there are NGOs who are funding these protests, and they're designed to radicalize Canadian society. That's just a reality. That certainly is the effect that they're having.
Hmm.
But there's another side to this immigration situation that
Okay.
I think we all need to look at, and that is Canada, as you say, has been a welcoming place.
Yeah.
Canada, the United States are nations primarily of immigrants, people who have come
Yep.
here from somewhere else. But what did they come with? They came in answer to a promise. They came in answer to a promise of what kind of country Canada would be.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
Canada, and we have to be careful not to paint everyone with the same
Yep.
brush.
I agree.
Many millions of the people who are coming to Canada are coming in answer to a promise. They want freedom. They want
Yeah.
prosperity. They want
Yeah.
religious tolerance. They want to live the Canadian dream. And we are breaking that promise to them because we're not offering them the same kind of opportunity that previous generations of immigrants had, and we're not even living up to the promise that we gave them, that they would be coming to a stable, secure, prosperous, country that is affordable to live in, a country that's safe. So the other side of this immigration story is that those of us who are here and have been living here for a long time, we're
Hmm.
letting down these newcomers. We're not living up to the promise that was given to them. And some people might say we don't care about that, but I think we need to care about that
Hmm.
because the Lord's second commandment says we have to love our neighbor.
Yep.
And we have to love our neighbor even if they're from another part of the world and they just got here. They're still our neighbor.
Yeah, well,
So
it's
that's
fascinating when you look at the Old Testament accounts of Israel and allowing non-Jewish people to join them and to serve
right.
their God together. They were welcomed. They were
Sure.
supposed to look out for them, look out for the strangers in your land.
Sure.
But they also had a very interesting caveat from the Lord, and that is that they were okay if they're going to live with you in this land. They're to follow the same laws, the
Right.
same principles, the same
Yeah.
values
Whether
as
you
you
go, I
hold.
shall go. Yeah, your God shall be my God. Yeah, absolutely. No, and that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely key. And of course, yeah, I'm just well trying to think how much time we have left here. I mean, there's so much to talk about here. I mean, we've got the Prime Minister cracking down on gun laws even more, some more personal freedoms being taken away, and so forth. So where is Canada headed over? I guess this next year, we've got an election coming, one way or the other, and it certainly might be an early election. All right, and I guess how much of a difference will that make? Are we as Canadians, you think, is that pendulum pointing toward yes, definite change, and are they okay with the change that goes a bit right of center? You think?
I think that my perspective is perhaps a little bit different from some people. I do
Okay.
think that Canada is coming back to a more conservative stance politically and economically and even socially. And I'll tell you why. I had a unique personal experience. I wouldn't say unique, but perhaps unusual for many Canadians. And that is right before the election, I was down in Henderson, Nevada. I was visiting my son who lives down there. And, I had nothing to do the day I was flying back. I went downstairs and asked the concierge, what's going on? What can I do? He says, well, Mr. Gray, there's a Trump rally right across the street. So I actually went across and I was in an auditorium, 20,000 people. And I
Wow.
was literally in a circle of roughly 250 people holding hands and praying to God that Donald Trump would win the election.
Wow.
And in that moment, in being there, I experienced MAGA, and it changed my perspective on it. And MAGA is not just a political movement. It's
Mm.
not just social conservatism. It's not just small government and cutting taxes and all that stuff. It is, I believe, it's a God ordained movement, and the Spirit of the Lord is involved in it and moving it. And what MAGA is, it's a made in America response to globalism. It's the antidote to globalism, which I consider, and I think all the evidence is in, that it's metaphysically evil. It's anti-human.
Mm.
It's anti-history. It's anti-God. And I think that already we're seeing the impacts of MAGA. Mr. Trump is not even in office yet, but we're seeing the impacts of this movement. We're seeing it over in Japan, in
Wow.
Hungary, in
And I got
Serbia.
to
We're
jump
seeing
in
the
there.
behavior. Yeah,
I'm running out of time. Leighton, I
yeah.
think you hit on something really good. We might have to continue this conversation down the road. But you're right. We need to cry out to God. And, there is a God thing happening, I think, some shifting that's taking place. So our guest again, Leighton Grey. Do check out his podcast, returntoreason.com. Thank you so much for watching. Check out wiseup.ca. God bless.